Do anything in the whole world, what would it be?
Inventor. Scientist. Ninja.
Talk to our ninjas about the 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
Do you think boys and girls should be able to do the same types of jobs?
Definitely.
Why should all kids get to go to school?
So they can learn.
Why do we need to learn?
So we know things when we grow up. 9 plus 9. We won't know what that is. That's 18.
The Sustainable Development Goals are the United Nations agenda to transform our world by 2030.
No poverty. Zero hunger. Good health and well-being.
What I'm going to get you to do is say to me what's written on your shirt.
Quality education. Gender equality. Clean water and sanitation. Affordable and clean energy. Decent work and economic growth. Industry, innovation and infrastructure. Reducing inequality. Sustainable cities and communities. Responsible consumption and production. Climate action.
Life below water.
I'm not gonna do it. Peace, justice and strong institution. Partnerships for the goals.
The goals may be ambitious, but so are the leaders of tomorrow. Join us in making the world a better place for future generations.
Go.
Life below water.
Nailed it.
Good evening, everybody, and we need data for every one of those 17 goals. Welcome here this evening for the public lecture on data for the planet. We are guests on this land, and I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Ngunnawal people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Anna Maria Arabia. I'm the Chief Executive of the Australian Academy of Science, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I would like to also acknowledge the support from the Australian Research Data Commons in hosting this lecture this evening, and thank our friends here at the ANU for hosting us. It is only with wonderful partnerships such as these that the Academy can continue to celebrate scientific excellence and promote international engagement. A core part of the Australian Academy of Sciences business is to represent Australia as the adhering body on the International Science Council, as well as some 40 scientific unions and interdisciplinary bodies that are members of it. These are not unions as we would typically imagine unions in Australia. These are organisations that set the standard for science globally. These are organisations, some of which were established 100 years ago, and they have promoted and safeguarded their scientific discipline through international cooperation ever since. They are also responsible for fundamental decisions about what elements belong on the periodic table and that pesky question around whether Pluto is really a planet. They have important roles in advocating for the freedom of science and scientists. Sadly, in countries around the world, some scientists are persecuted for doing their job. And not all scientists enjoy the freedom of movement and expression that we have here in Australia. The Academy has represented Australia as a member of the International Science Council since its inception in 1954, 65 years ago. And over the years, Australians have made great contributions to science globally through the Academy's membership. Just last month, the Academy published a report entitled The Benefits of Australian Membership of the International Science Council and International Scientific Unions. This report outlines the economic and scientific benefits of Australia's membership of the major global scientific organisations. The report notes that the diplomacy through science provides benefits to Australia and to the national interest. Copies are available here this evening. I believe they're outside or on the table near the entrance, but they are also available online and can be downloaded. As you would be aware, the International Science Council has a committee on data, CODATA, and that's why we're here tonight. CODATA exists to promote global collaboration to advance open science and to improve the availability and usability of data for all areas of research. CODATA supports the principle that data produced by research and susceptible to be used for research should be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. CODATA also works to make data fair, that is, findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. I'm delighted at the strong attendance at this evening's lecture. This audience needs no convincing on the importance of advancing the science of data as a means of advancing science as a global public good. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Simon Hodson, the Executive Director of CODATA. Simon is an expert in data policy issues and research data management. Simon was the chair of the European Commission's expert group on fair data and is the project director of the African Open Science Project. We are thrilled Simon could visit Australia. Earlier today we had some very fruitful discussions about data science that included Simon and representatives from across the research ecosystem. And I'm very much looking forward to continuing those discussions and what we can do in partnership across the science sector. And like you, I'm very much looking forward to hearing Simon deliver his lecture on how CODATA is using data for our planet. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Simon Hodson.
Thank you. Good morning. Sorry. That's a predictable jet lag joke. Thank you very much, Anna Maria. Thank you very much to the Academy for the invitation and to ARDC. And I'd like to thank very much the people that have been organising this. There's lots of people that have been organising this behind the scenes, but in particular I've been dealing with Leslie Wyborn, who's the chair of the National Committee on Data in Science. There's that preposition that I was unsure of, for Data in Science, with Adrian Burton and with Simon Cox. Adrian Burton from ARDC and Simon Cox, who's on the Executive Committee of CODATA. In the very detailed run notes that I was sent about my activities here, I've had meetings all day since 8 a.m. this morning. I saw Simon's magical presentation, which I felt was putting a little bit of pressure, but also the terminology is important. And the term magical has gone through something of an evolution in the country that I originally came from. It's more associated with magical thinking and I'm trying to avoid a particular word. I'm going to say it, the clusterfuck that is Brexit. So I couldn't think of an appropriate synonym. Magical thinking is the thinking that some Brexit supporters think will allow us to keep the border open with Ireland with through technological means. And it was condemned by Michel Barnier, the negotiator from the European Commission, as magical thinking. Why am I talking about this, you might think? Because it brought to mind this cartoon, which is often used to explain the way in which science is sometimes communicated. Calculation, a miracle occurs. This is often in project proposals, and I'm sure some of you who've written project proposals might recognise this. A miracle occurs, and then we have the output. But I thought this also illustrates what I'm going to try and talk about, which is that precise area where, if you like, the data hits the code, where we analyse the data, where we extract meaning from it. We have to be a bit more explicit about what is going on there, what we're doing, why we're doing it, and why, when the data hits the code, meaning is extracted. And I hope that will make sense a little bit as I go on. I'm going to talk a lot about a particular initiative that CODATA's working on as part of the International Science Council's new Science Action Plan. And I'll start off by talking about one of the particular organizations and projects that we're working with as part of that initiative. Then I'll come back to explaining a little bit of other things that CODATA does before coming back to talk about that initiative, Data for the Planet, and extracting meaning from cross-disciplinary and complex research areas. So as part of this initiative, we've been working with IDO, those dreadful acronyms, the Infectious Disease Data Observatory, who do something incredibly important. They seek to gather and to make data available relating to what's often rather depressingly called neglected tropical diseases. They gather data of various sorts, from laboratory data, epidemiological data, clinical trial data, patient data. They do their best to make that available in a usable format for researchers internationally. And the power of what they do is in the aggregation of data for particular outbreaks, in that collection of data from various sites. And so we can try and build up a big picture of how a particular outbreak proceeded and the epidemiology of such disease outbreaks. And so it'll come as no surprise in that context that they did a lot of work with the 2014 to 2016 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. This slide is from Laura Merson of that organization. So the response by international organizations was very strong. Lots of NGOs, lots of research organizations, lots of clinical trials, and this came as a surprise, obviously my naivety, clinical trials which were conducted in situ on people with Ebola, patient data, etc. But there is a significant problem with understanding how that outbreak proceeded at a more detailed and fine-grained level. Because when the outbreak ended and the international organizations left the region and researchers left the region and the people that conducted the clinical trials left the region and the people who did the genome sequencing left the region, so also did the data. And it was scattered to the four winds. So a study by Elizabeth Pisani and others estimates that 65% of the study data is not available and has not been shared. And that is, it's actually outrageous. So this data has been taken back to organizations in North America, in Europe, and elsewhere. It has been used for research studies, and those have been published. And so you can make top-level inferences from the way the data is presented, but you can't access the data. And there is a reluctance to share those data because it's an asset. We talk a lot about data being an asset, but it's an asset for those particular research groups. And again, I think it's a tragedy, it's outrageous, it's practically criminal. So I think that's an important point to make at the outset, that the activities that I'm going to describe are happening in a context where there are a number of challenges to data aggregation and to understanding particular events. The World Health Organization has published top-level incident, so when someone gets the Ebola virus, and mortality or survival data, which is broadly speaking geolocated. So we do have an idea about how the outbreak proceeded, but we can't make more fine-grained analyses of it except by reference to those of individual studies as they're published, and we can't look at the data as a whole and take a systems approach, and integrate those data with other data which would be important, such as vector data, transport data, climate data, etc., etc. So, one of the things that we've been doing with these case studies is looking at the challenges that exist in particular research areas, and in particular grand challenge research areas, to draw information from data. So here there's an issue of data access, and also one of the things that the Infectious Disease Data Observatory struggles with is that the data that's communicated to them is often in PDF scans of handwritten notes, even the clinical data or the patient data. There's a lack of metadata, data about data, that allows it to be discovered, aggregated, and integrated to take a systems approach. A lack of a data dictionary, which defines terms across the various data sets that one might want to analyze, and the technical challenge of integrating and analyzing trials and clinical data and other relevant data, as I've already mentioned. So that's a bit of scene setting of one example of why this is important. I'm going to segue into talking a little bit about CODATA and then come back to the initiative which comes under the heading of this talk. So CODATA has been mentioned is the Committee on Data of the International Science Council. We've actually existed since 1966, and we've ploughed a furrow on data quality issues, data aggregation issues, data cataloging issues, standardization, etc., etc. In its latest iteration, our strategy has 4 particular pillars. We do a lot of work and have done historically on data policies, so advocating those things that Anna Maria mentioned, the availability of data, open data as much as possible, as open as possible, but of course as closed as necessary to protect privacy, etc. We promote various principles around how you make data available to the greatest utility of researchers and society. Do a lot of work in data science. We have a data science journal, and we run regular conferences. We have have training programs internationally in partnership with the Research Data Alliance. We run a series of itinerant schools of research data science, looking at the science of research data and training young researchers or data stewards in particular data skills. And we do a lot of work on data good practices, promoting and helping design and strategize open science platforms, as in the African Open Science Platform Project, which has already been mentioned, or this initiative on data interoperability for multidisciplinary research. So it's quite a large portfolio. Something also that CODATA has done since 1969 is convene a task group on the fundamental physical constants. And this is an incredibly important piece of work. That task group has, as I say, since 1969, roughly every 3 to 4 years, they review the existing data from metrology labs to measure the speed of light, Planck's constant, Boltzmann's constant, etc., to calculate those constants. And they produce a reference list of the recommended values, which are then used in high-energy physics, in astronomy, etc., etc. And they're referred to and used, and anyone who's done physics has probably seen these references, or even has the pocket card. I've got about 10 pocket cards in my rucksack that I can hand out later. Something very important happened in November last year, in that the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, which has its seat also in Paris near Versailles, convened its membership, and its membership agreed that the SI system, the International System of Units, rather than for certain remaining units like the kilogram the amp and the Kelvin, the Moore, rather than being based upon physical objects or physical measurements. So this is on the right of the screen there, is the big K, the kilogram, the titanium, lump of titanium which is the reference kilogram. The kilogram will no longer be based upon that physical object, but will be derived mathematically from the Planck constant, which is the constant that gives matter mass. That decision was made in November and was implemented on the 20th of May, very recently. So now when you measure the speed of, or when you use anything that weighs, that references the kilogram, scales or whatever, it's now referring that reference not to that kilogram, but to a value that was calculated by the CODATA task group. If we worked out the economic impact of that, I think that would be enormous. And I find that fascinating. So with the committee on data of the International Science Council, and the International Science Council, like many organizations, has gone through a number of iterations and evolutions. It was established in the 1930s, I forget the year exactly, as the International Council of Scientific Unions. It was the umbrella body for those entities which have a membership and speak for particular disciplines internationally. In 1998, it changed its name, but not its acronym, funnily enough, to the International Council for Science. And then last year, it fused with the International Social Science Council to create a new body, the International Science Council. There's only so many times you can, and so many orders that you can mix those words. But the important thing about that, the new International Science Council, is it can claim to speak and to represent, it does represent, both the natural, the physical, and the social sciences. And it acts as the international voice of science through that representation from academies, which in various countries are members, from international scientific unions, which are members, and it is the recognized and official voice of science in the UN system. And that for us was an important step because it meant that we could explicitly rather than implicitly argue that we're interested in data and we care about data from all branches of research. That merger of ICSU as was and ISSC was inevitable, it can be argued, because of the way research is conducted in the early 20th century and the research challenges we face. On the right of the screen, there are 3 of the international programs which have been sponsored, promoted, convened by ICSU, in partnership, in any case, with ISSC. Future Earth, which we've already heard about, integrated research on disaster risk and urban health and well-being and systems approach. What those 3 programs have in common is they take an explicitly cross-disciplinary, in some cases explicitly transdisciplinary, it's a specific term, it's a specific methodology, approach to major global challenges of the 21st century. Concerned about human adaptation to and mitigation of climate change, concerned with understanding disasters and minimizing disaster risk, concerned with health in our cities, and with understanding cities as a system and the human interaction with cities as a system. Each of those areas of research needs the input of researchers from many different disciplines and needs to gather and analyze data from many different sources. in a city, you need to analyze urban health and well-being, consider the health data, consider the economic data, consider the transport data, the pollution data, etc., etc., etc. So that forms one of the prefaces for, or the premises rather, for the program I'm talking about. I want to mention in relation to this and in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals as well, this report, I think from 2013 or 2014, so a little bit old now, but I mention it because of the importance of the title, A World That Counts. And I've always very much liked the wordplay in that council, in that title from the UN expert group that produced that report. A world that counts, a world that matters, that's important. It's just the only world we got. But also a world that counts and that measures itself in order to understand itself. And that's in many respects the thinking behind the Sustainable Development Goals. And that in the end must be our thinking behind any science that seeks to understand global change and respond to it. We can only respond to the things that we understand through measuring them. So, in order to measure things, you need to gather data, you need to analyze those data. And we hear a lot about data is the new oil. There are some senses in which that analogy might work if it wasn't just the worst kind of snake oil marketing language. I'm giving away what I think about that argument already. It is, we can argue that data in the broadest sense is a key component of the information revolution that's transformed our lives, and is at least as transformative as the carbon revolution that underpinned the Industrial Revolution. So to that extent, one can see what they're driving at. And there is a value chain whereby the more the data is refined and curated, the more value it has, the more utility it has, the better it can be used. But there is of course, a fundamental difference in that data are not exhausted when they're used, and they, added to that, they don't contribute to pollution and to the greenhouse effect. So I would really prefer that people, particularly in the scientific community and the marketers for providers of information system, would stop talking about data being the new oil. There's a very good analogy for the data and its utility, which is renewable energy. Because data is infinitely renewable. And that's an important point, because it can be reused. This is a nice illustration of that from George Bernard Shaw about open knowledge. If you have an apple and I have an apple and we exchange these apples, then we'll still have one apple each. These are competitive goods. But if you have an idea and I have an idea and we exchange these ideas, when each of us have two ideas. The same applies to data, and the ideas are generally relate to or apply to data or to evidence that's created in one way or another. And all that is to make the case that data should be as reusable as possible. Caveat always that as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. And there's various reasons which we should all be very familiar about why certain data can't be shared or made open. But it's also more complicated than that, and I wanted to mention this in relation to these marketing slogans about data being the new oil. We talk a lot about, or we hear a lot about big data. And, of course, the capacity to generate enormous quantities of data through genome sequencing, through sensor networks, through the Internet of Things, etc., has transformed some areas of research and has certainly transformed our lives. And we shouldn't be ignorant of the challenges that confronts us with in terms of data storage, data stewardship, data analysis. But it's not the only problem, and this is an excellent book and very a very useful book from Christine Borgman, which presents these ideas of big data, little data, and no data. And it reminds us, and we should be mindful of, that big data is not the only challenge. Sometimes the challenge is little data, the sort of data which is collected from individual people, the sort of data that is collected through detailed interviews or studies and can only be understood effectively through very detailed stewardship and metadata. And it remains the case that in many areas of research, one of our significant challenges is actually the absence of data, is no data. Those areas of research where we desperately need to gather the data in order to pursue particular research questions. Now, Anna Maria actually let the cat out of the bag. I was going to use this slide to say, who has heard about FAIR and knows what the FAIR principles are? You were all listening at the beginning, weren't you? So don't give yourself away if you weren't listening. So FAIR, of course, stands for the FAIR principles and this idea that greater utility can be extracted from data if they are findable, if they're accessible, if they're interoperable and reusable. And the canonical text for that is that DOI there. Those are the FAIR principles in detail. I'm not going to go through those, but that slide's there as reference if the slide deck is made available and shared. But I'll give a sort of a more specific précis. I've dealt with the FAIR principles and how to implement them a great deal. Last year I chaired the European expert group on turning FAIR into reality, which produced that report. And although it's rather impolite to hawk one's own research activities or publications, I do like to think that we put an awful lot of work into it, and the collective work of that expert group is a very usable guide to how to implement the FAIR data principles. So what does it mean in reality? That we have that the data should have sufficiently rich metadata, the information about the data, to be discovered. So if you're looking for data on a particular subject or on a particular geographical location or about a particular disease, for example, that it's easy to find, and find with a reasonable degree of granularity. That it's accessible through a specific protocol. That's not the same as saying it's open. It could be behind some form of access requirement or protection, but it's accessible and ideally over the web and available for programmatic access. And something that's very important in the FAIR principles, which is sometimes neglected, is that they should apply equally for humans and for machines, as the jargon goes, for humans using machines or algorithms or programmatic access or analysis to data, such that the data can be analyzed at scale. That they should be interoperable, and in the FAIR principles that's described as using a formal, accessible, shared and broadly applicable language for knowledge representation. And in practical terms it means that, for example, the descriptions of the variables followed a shared specification such that the data are comparable and commensurable. And that the data are reusable, and the definition of that is that they've got a usage license which tells the human, and ideally the human using the machine or the machine, how the data can be used under what conditions. But above all, that the provenance of information is communicated. You know how the data were created, you know to what extent it can be trusted, what the calibration was on the machine that gathered it, what methodology may have been used in the process to the protocol to gather the data, etc. And these things are very important, and the FAIR principles boil down a lot of discussion into a very accessible and memorable and easily communicable set of principles. So that's some of the context, and FAIR influences a lot of our thinking about the program, which I'll spend the last little third of the talk discussing. So I'll remind you of that slide about the Grand Challenge programs and the programs of the International Science Council. And we've been arguing for some time within the International Science Council context that the interoperability of data in interdisciplinary Grand Challenge research is one of the major challenges for global research, for the reasons I've already touched upon, because of the heterogeneity of those data, because of the importance of those research areas, because of the difficulty in some instances, as with the Ebola outbreak, of accessing those data. So for a little while, we've been exploring those issues with support from the International Science Council, and it's important to stress, again, as I did in discussing this activity this morning, that this initiative came from a proposal that was made to CODATA at one of our conferences some time ago by the Australian National Committee, that it was important for us to work with the international scientific unions on their processes of standardization of data specifications and to work across research disciplines. And we've been doing this sort of work for some time. We've done work on a specification for nanomaterials research and in relation to disaster risk research. So with pilot funding ultimately from the International Science Council, we've pursued this activity to try and understand over the last 2 years or so how we could improve the way in which data in multidisciplinary or cross-disciplinary research areas could be used and could interoperate. From a series of workshops, we identified 3 pilot case studies in infectious diseases, as has been noted, working with the Infectious Disease Data Observatory, in disaster risk reduction, working with a CODATA task group, with Public Health England, with the Integrated Research on Disaster Risk, and looking at issues around data for the Sendai disaster risk reduction reporting process, which is analogous to the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure you're all aware of Sendai. And looking at issues of resilient cities with an international network, but including in particular Resilience Brokers, which is a UK-based NGO. And the idea is to work with those case studies, and a team of data scientists or collaborators with the domain scientists and the data providers to first of all try and understand the challenges, and then to intervene and propose solutions, whether those solutions are solutions of policy, of practice, or of technical adjustments such that the data can be more readily used. And we try to communicate that in that diagram, working initially with the pilots relatively separately, but hoping that there are cross-cutting findings that will benefit each of those research domains. Also, through that series of workshops, we developed this cyclical, what we hope will be a cyclical methodology of identifying the pilot studies, of running them through what we've rather grandly, hubristically called the data integration intelligence methodology, to understand the pilot and the questions they're asking, the data that they need to gather, the opportunities and the challenges for using those data, and particularly the data integration or interoperability, developing through intensive workshopping, recommendation requirements, and then the idea and the hope that that could be implemented and we'd have improved research and more generic lessons for those interdisciplinary research areas. That's more we're nowhere near there yet. We're really at phase 1 to 4 and cycling through that. but we hope through a larger and more long-term international program that we'd be able to implement that data integration intelligence methodology. And we hope also to be able to add the number of pilots beyond the 3 that we've started with in areas certainly of health, perhaps in human interactions with biodiversity, perhaps in agricultural data of various sorts, but that's to be decided. I've already covered this a little bit, but the sort of data audits that we prepared with the pilot studies, we tried to run them through these questions in order to understand what are the overarching research challenges that you're facing? What are the questions that you're asking, that you're seeking to answer? What sort of data are you trying to gather to respond to these questions? And then these more detailed questions to try and understand the data and the challenges that are being faced. And that's how we came across these issues with the Ebola outbreak. Who owns the data? What's the licensing? What's the data format? How easily can that be reused and integrated with other data? What's the metadata used? What provenance information is provided? Etc., etc., etc. So really to do a detailed study of those data. And we brought that together in a workshop that we ran with the Data Documentation Initiative last year at the Dargstuhl venue, which is a venue used by, well, which is part of the Leibniz Foundation in Germany, which hosts week-long retreat-style intensive workshops on computer science and information science related topics. It's quite difficult to get space at that venue, and so we're very grateful for the partnership with the DDI to allow us to do that. This is a work in progress. The information that was gathered through that data audit activity with the pilots was very rich, as I hope you'll see, but it was still significantly short of being sufficiently rich to allow us to draw very concrete conclusions. And we want to be clear both about the significance of this challenge, the significance of the challenges involved, the progress that we have already made, but also how much progress still needs to be made, but how important this topic is. So you'll remember this slide of the findings and the challenges from the infectious disease outbreak case study. I'll now go through, and what I hope will be of interest, some of our findings through that process and through the work at the Dargstuhl workshop and the subsequent efforts to draw conclusions and lessons from that first cycle in our methodology. So each pilot case study came up with findings and recommendations about their research area, about the data, and about the challenges that they have to integrate and use those data to prosecute the sort of research that they seek to pursue. And so these are some very preliminary, and in some instances very basic, but nevertheless really important recommendations. So the utility and the value of the FAIR principles was highlighted. It's become a common language that's very useful for talking about data issues. And make data available in CSV files if it's simple tabular data, not as a PDF. And that lesson can be applied to many areas of research, and in particular to those areas of research that still like to communicate their data as supplementary files in journals and as supplementary files containing images of tables which can be looked at by humans but not reanalyzed by machines. Good practices, data dictionaries with appropriate metadata and semantics. And then these last 2 points, which I think are very important in their recommendations, which are really about the community ethos and the culture in infectious disease research, and also significant in terms of that, again, the tragic expropriation or the departure of the data relating to the Ebola outbreak, to encourage community principles of data sharing and documentation, which a number of communities internationally are working on, to provide repository infrastructure of this, and to ensure that those repository infrastructures are sustained, and to initiate a long-term process of consensus building and adoption of appropriate data, metadata standards, and controlled vocabularies that enable epidemiological, demographic, socioeconomic, clinical, laboratory, and genomic data to be linked, queried, and integrated more effectively. That is important. It's easy. It's relatively easy to say. It took me a while, but it's also incredibly challenging to implement. But if we don't focus on that sort of activity, that long-term process of consensus building as the foundation of our research, of our science in particular disciplines, then it won't advance as we wish it to. So as I said, I'm going to go through the other case studies that we've been working on. We worked with Resilience Brokers, which, as I said, is a UK-based NGO, which is working with a number of cities internationally and city regions, including Hunter Valley in Australia, but I don't have an example about that, and who have a data analysis and integration platform called Resilience.io, which was originally based upon software and a system produced at Imperial College in London. It's an agent-based modelling system which allows you to simulate population of the city region and to run models based upon particular choices and behaviours. And it's got a growing software library of what they call input-output process blocks, which really allow you to model transfer of energy, transfer of resources, etc. Any of the particular processes that you want to consider within that modelling system. In their work with us, they're working with a number of cities internationally, but we particularly drew evidence from their work with Accra on water resources, and we also piloted an activity with Medellin, which is still a work in process, on pollution and the relation of pollution to health outcomes and economic impact. Again, I hope you can see that these are challenging and important issues. The work with Accra that Resilience Brokers had been doing goes back a few years and had some significant funding from DFID among others. And it involved working very closely with the city authorities and a major activity of data creation, of data gathering, to understand and to try and model what Accra's water needs would be in the next decades, with growing population, with growing urbanization, with limitation of water resources, with the potential for water scarcity, etc. And the challenges involved in that data creation should not be underestimated. It was very, very significant work that they had to put in. They spent a lot of time in Accra and working with and training with the people involved with that. The data sets are openly available at that URL, and even the separate data sets are pretty interesting. But their objective was to allow the modelling of the water needs on a relatively fine grain scale, and the costing, and above all, modelling the costing of solutions, and to try and identify through their modelling process potential solutions and their economic costs. It certainly showed the labour-intensive nature of this sort of data gathering as it stands, but that can be improved, and it showed the effectiveness of the platform they use, the Resilience.io platform. And also, inevitably, uncovered considerable challenges of data quality and metadata quality. There's a report from PwC for the European Commission that suggests that in some research areas, research groups may invest 80% of their time, or at least 80% of their resource, on what's known in the trade as data wrangling, of data cleaning, of working with the data to make it usable. And all that time, although it's necessary and important, we could be a lot more efficient about that. Automatic ingest and processing, more effective use of metadata, and adoption of the FAIR principles. And the work in Accra demonstrated how difficult data gathering in a systematic and effective way can be. And so the sort of recommendations, so the need for improved data stewardship, application of FAIR principles, improved semantics will greatly assist this process and the effective analysis of those data. And I was asked whether I was going to mention the SDGs. I'm not as such, but obviously the work that they were doing relates to clean water and sanitation and to... Actually, we should... I don't know why I haven't put 11 there, which is urban... which is healthy cities. The work with Medellin in Colombia has a similar, unsurprisingly similar set of findings. It's still very much work in progress. It's using existing data sets, and Medellin has had a considerable effort to make its urban data available, though some of the data sets necessary for this sort of analysis aren't openly available, particularly the health data sets at the fine-grained level that we would like. Again, significant interoperability challenges, particularly in terms of spatial and temporal parameters used, different data sets using different parameters, and this is a common problem, different time periods, different ways of communicating the geotemporal location of the incident which is being measured. So clearly valuable to enhance standards and definitions for metadata, to refine the research processes and methodologies for the measurement of city, region, and region level indicators. And again, similar recommendations, the use of the FAIR principles, the importance of the alignment of discovery and collection level metadata, and the alignment of variable specifications, such that the data can be analyzed across data sets, such that it can be effectively integrated into a system such as Resilience IO and used to do the modeling, the complex modeling that resilience brokers specialize in. So the third case study, I think in the interest of time I'll pass over quite quickly, was concerned with disaster risk reduction and the use of data for Sendai reporting. Now, the Sendai process, a little bit like the SDG process, involves nations reporting against a number of key metrics. And it's an incredible opportunity to communicate more than the particular Sendai target or the particular Sendai reporting metric, because the data that's gathered to arrive at that figure of mortality, total mortality through disasters in a given year, for example, comes from many different sources and many different disasters and incidents. The reporting against economic loss also has many components. Bizarrely, the people that work in this space talk about disaggregated data, meaning the data which contributes towards those Sendai reporting targets. And I would think of that rather as pre-aggregated data. It's each of the particular estimates of economic loss or loss of agriculture or loss of buildings or mortality is then, one would have thought, bundled up through various methodologies and some estimations to provide the Sendai reporting figure. But people talk about it as, are we going to require or can we encourage nations to communicate the disaggregated data or the pre-aggregated data, which would be incredibly useful to better understand particular disasters and their costs. The group here did a particular study on the challenges of reporting mortality, of gathering the challenges of gathering those data, the number of deaths due to a given disaster, because deaths are variously reported. On the cause of death, it may be electrocution, and it goes in as a death through execution. The fact that the electrocution was caused by a falling tree on a falling due to, for example, a storm, means that there is a risk, and is often the case, that death is not included in the disaster reporting. And so a common finding in studies of Sendai reporting or similar activities is that mortality is wildly underestimated because the additional related cause of deaths aren't included. And the case study of that was in Puerto Rico in the storm, or in Haiti, in the Haiti earthquake, where both of those, the mortality due to those incidents was wildly underestimated at the outset. Nations are having considerable challenge gathering the data and reporting the data. Again, the lack of data, the no data issue, the mechanisms to gather the data necessary for Sendai reporting do not exist, and there's considerable concerns about data quality, partly because of those definitional issues, and partly because of a lack of transparency from governments and a reluctance to, as we were taught in maths, to show their workings. Yeah, a reluctance to communicate those disaggregated data and to show how the Sendai reporting figure was arrived at. At an intensive workshop that I attended on this, I don't think it's unfair to name the country. Of all countries, Japan, where the agreement was defined, where there are so many disasters, were refused outright. We are not going to engage in this discussion about reporting disaggregated data, which I found astonishing. But governments are very concerned about the optics of reporting on disaster mortality and loss. Perhaps we can understand that, but without that transparency, how are we ever going to implement the Sendai framework, and how are we going to really understand how to reduce mortality and the cost of disasters? Some very concrete recommendations came out of this case study and this analysis, which are leading immediately to a UN DRR, which is the new name for UN ISDR, the UN's disaster risk reduction, I don't know what you call it, platform. So they're going to set up a technical working group on hazard terminology and classification. So even the specific definition of what a hazard is and understanding against what disaster we're reporting needs to be established. And this is why I said at the outset that the definitional issues in science in general, but in relation to data, are particularly important. Again, fair features and the importance of the contribution of the scientific community and not just the governmental monitoring community to the Sendai process and to understanding disaster risk reduction. And once again, this need for community action, for international cooperation to develop the standard protocols for exchanging data and metadata. And as with all of these case studies, but this case study in particular, there's an article in production which looks at the contribution that data science and FAIR might make to improved reporting against the Sendai framework. So we've been working on this activity and have made a proposal or have contributed to the project ideas that have gone into the consideration by the community of the International Science Council as part of their new science action plan. We're hopeful, well, we know that was well received through the first round. We were asked to refine that proposal further, and we're hopeful that with further seed funding will be granted in order for us to establish a major international program on this issue. There I lay out 5 work packages as we think of them. The mobilization of expertise in data science to support these research areas and support that community activity to refine specifications. Something that I haven't touched on a great deal is that programmatic data integration, enabling machine-assisted programmatic discovery, which is important. It's not the be-all and end-all. It's not an ultimate solution. It's not a silver bullet, as the cliche goes, but it's nevertheless important that we applied machine learning and what's sometimes called artificial intelligence to these issues. Above all, this process, which is part of the CODATA strategy of identifying, documenting, and recommending good practices, and working with particular disciplines and communities on that process. The interdisciplinary case studies, continuing and expanding that group of case studies, and which I particularly want to mention, the projects and working with international scientific unions or other representatives of international research endeavors. And has already been mentioned, this American Geophysical Union project on implementing FAIR data, I think has been very successful and shows a model of how that work with particular disciplines could be taken forward. So closing this talk, I hope that this has given you some insight into that activity, into the importance of FAIR and the importance of open science. This statement came from the UN Science and Technology Forum, to which ISC contributes. Global society is confronted by multiple intersecting sets of converging environmental, socio-economic, political and cultural problems, challenges, many as a consequence of complex coupling between social and biogeophysical processes. That's a bit jargonistic. I think I know who wrote that. I won't say who. But it tries to encapsulate this concern that we're facing very complex processes, and unless we gather the data effectively to understand those processes, unless we have the mechanisms to model them and to analyze them, we are not going to be able to understand them properly or to identify solutions. So I hope that's enough to maybe initiate a discussion about those challenges. We argue that this is one of the major scientific challenges of the age. I'd be keen to see whether we can discuss that and whether you're at all convinced. To improve the effectiveness of research, we need to focus on some of the data issues, and that's not a distraction from the research itself. Sometimes in the sphere of work that I work in, yes, but what about the science? What about the research? Why are we concerned with the data? These definitions, these specifications of what it is we're measuring and how we're communicating that are fundamental to the science. And coordination of that, collaboration of that, the development of that through scientific communities, I think should be a core activity of those bodies that represent science internationally, the international science unions, the academies, and international collaboration. In the end, it's what international collaborations have had to do. If we look at some of the case studies in astronomy, in material sciences, some areas of remote sensing, international collaborations have had to work on data specifications, because unless we do, the data can't be communicated and it can't be commensurable. And we need to, I think, expand that activity beyond those particular success stories to other research areas, and in particular the interdisciplinary research areas that I've mentioned. I'll close with a plug for the next CODATA conference, which is in Beijing in September. It's preceded by a high-level workshop on data policy issues, which has been stimulated by the Chinese State Council law on good data management, which I think will be a fascinating topic, and we can learn from and compare data policies in different countries and geographies. And the Beijing conference is designed to tackle a number of issues of interest to people that care about data and the role of data in science, and might be of interest to people in this room. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Simon, for that snapshot of the foundational work of CODATA and the really inspiring use cases that you've picked out in those 3 areas. Hand over for any questions from the audience for Simon. Right, let's start over there. Donald?
Thanks very much indeed, Simon. I just wanted to take this back almost to the beginning of your talk. I think probably pretty much everybody in this room thoroughly recognises and is supportive of the goal of trying to address all of the data challenges in order to support these big societal and other goals. Yet we find ourselves, I think, living in a time which for many of us seems to be much keener on magical thinking than we expected to see again. Do you have any comments or thoughts on how, as researchers, as data scientists and others, we can be doing a better job of communicating and selling this kind of vision, which seems so incredibly urgent with so many really major challenges we face, all of which can only be addressed with transdisciplinary data?
That's a very good question, a very challenging thing. I suppose if I knew that, I'd be a politician and not a jobbing executive director. But I fully agree with the issue in the diagnosis. It's very frustrating well, actually, it's quite nice to have moved away from the UK, but it's frustrating to have to observe what's going on there. And during the Brexit referendum, people say we don't need experts. And both in the UK and the US and in other countries, for people who talk about science and who talk about evidence-based thinking and these sort of things to be dismissed as elitist, for this elision and this decidedly unfair, inaccurate elision to be made between the economic inequalities which exist and the origins of those and the social ills that relate to those things. And yet, in some ways, the global elites that are being blamed for this are not the global elites that caused it, the banking system and the deregulators, etc., but are the global elites who speak for science and who speak for the role of universities or education in society, and who argue for evidence-based solutions. I find that frustrating, tragic, and how we address that is another question which I think is beyond my pay grade. But yeah, no, I mean, I'm struggling to find a good answer to that. Part of it is communication, it's science communication, and I'm sure, frustratingly enough, it's that scientists like to talk about complexity and error bars and uncertainty, and the recent IPBES report is littered with all these estimates of the reliability of the data upon which every single statement in that report is made. I mean, it's a fantastic piece of work. It's got, and it's fascinating to see this statement is very strongly supported by science. This statement is very strongly supported by the literature, but the literature probably hasn't had enough data to, I forget the exact terminology, but anyone who's had a look at the IPBES report will know what I'm referring to. That's really important for decision making and for understanding the origin and the basis of the evidence, but it's perhaps not the best way of communicating to people that want simple messages. Unfortunately, is the answer to dumb down and to find sort of little catchphrases or simple ways of communicating science? I'm not sure. probably starts in primary school with the kids with the SDGs.
Thank you very much. I know it's not easy doing such compelling and rich presentations first thing in the morning. My question relates to some of the comments in the middle around data and global warming. There are some estimates that suggest that 10% of the world's energy budget is currently used to power data storage facilities, and that could increase in the next 10 years to up to 30% if you include data storage facilities and the computational objects required to power analysis, machine learning, deep learning, all that kind of thing. With that in mind, are you thinking about that at all as you work on kind of data into the future?
Deduplicate cat videos would be a glib answer to that. A lot of data, I mean, that's all data, not just scientific data. I think net neutrality and probably the use of data storage, data centers and analysis is an important principle. Even that's under attack. So I'm not suggesting that we have a hierarchy of data values. I do think the answer to that is, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think the collection and the analysis of data for science is really important. Otherwise, what have we got? And so the solution has to lie in technology. And I know that that's an argument that is used by climate people who want to resist response to climate change. Oh, we'll find a technological solution. We'll dump the carbon somewhere. But improved efficiency of data storage and compute will be necessary. I don't think we can go back on that particular need. So Iceland's going to get is going to make a lot of money out of data storage and compute because the cooling and the energy is there. That probably wasn't a very good answer. But
Simon, thanks very much for bringing me up to speed on the fantastic work that's happened at CODATA and the framework that you've put in place. The issue that I see with this challenge is actually that huge challenge that you have in herding all those cats that we call scientists and getting them to play. Yep. Have you given much thought as to how you're going to wrangle that cohort into accepting the fair principles and actually benefiting from having done so? Because at the end of the day, the responses that we see from that cohort are very much around the rewards and recognition systems that we currently have in place. And at the moment, they're very individually focused and reward excellence of an individual. How do we change that so we get a different culture and a different approach to gender that rewards people who will play in this space? That must happen.
Yeah. Again, a really important question. I think you're absolutely right about the major challenges, and there is no simple answer to that, but there are a number of related answers that we pursue, and in pursuing them we have to be both impatient to make progress and patient knowing that it's a significant challenge. I do think that FAIR, simply by encapsulating a set of principles in an easily communicable message, and I suppose this is my answer to what I should have said to Donald earlier, is that that's an example of effective communication. I mean, I really do think that this is the naivety of optimism, but there's been a little bit of a tipping point with FAIR, just to the extent to which it's been communicated and seems to have been taken up by a lot of research communities that hitherto were less concerned with these issues. In the end, you're absolutely right. I think two factors in particular are important. One is the self-reflection of particular research domains or disciplines in saying, how do we want to conduct our science? What is it that we do? I mean, it's almost that philosophical question. What is it that we do and why? What are we trying to achieve? And how do we want to communicate our research outputs? And some reflection on that without presuppositions, I think, is really important. We shouldn't assume that we have to adapt the existing journal system or the existing reward system. I think we need to do some fresh thinking about how it is we want to communicate science and what's important to communicate. The new president of CODATA, Baron Mons, likes to say, not entirely jokingly, that we need to communicate data with a supplementary article. That the whole significance of what we communicate needs to change. Actually, he would say the data and the algorithm or the code and a supplementary article. And I think the other thing, yes, it relates to that. It's the reward system, and you're absolutely right. We need to step back from counting just the analog paper PDF article as the unit by which we measure scientific contribution. Again, that's easier said than done, but there are a lot of voices now that are saying this has to change. This has to change. And I hope the new leadership of the International Science Council, which believes very strongly in these issues, I hope the partnership between the International Science Council, for example, and the UN system, and INCSA, which is the International Network of Government Science Advisors, will start having some of the mechanisms to make these high-level policy decisions. But we also need to engage with particular research communities, and there are some causes for optimism there, again, by reference to the American Geophysical Union's activities, which at least has made this very relatively small but fundamental change. You must communicate the data that's related to the article, and it should be in a repository, not as supplementary material. So we're beginning to see some signs of change.
Thanks, Simon. I'm really quite interested in the FAIR principles and the application across all the different case studies. One thing I've seen is people talking about FAIR, the ER, and I think they stand for ethical and responsible. And I was just, and it goes back to one of your original questions around, why are we doing it? And maybe that's that responsible side of things. What are the implications of why you're wanting to, play with data and do? And that can have a political effect. And the ethical part is how we do it, and also the perspective, and how we do that is making sure we're also including different perspectives or different worldviews that may not be a Western science perspective. So, welcome your thoughts on eventually adding in the ER.
All right. I used to work for a funding agency, and I often felt, reading funding proposals, that I wished the originators of the proposal had spent more time describing the work packages, the outcomes, the impacts, and the methodologies that they would use than coming up with incredibly original or convoluted acronyms for their project. The risk in presenting a set of principles as an acronym is that the creativity of scientific and intellectual communities immediately wants to, but what about, and adapt it, and I think, well, I know at least one of the alternatives was proposed by Laura Merson, who's one of the pilot leads, and I think it was free-fairer. I would strongly, and we wrote this in the European Commission report, I would strongly resist that temptation, and it is a temptation. It's an intellectual game temptation, and it's what we do as researchers. I do think we just sometimes have to recognize, actually, this is a pretty damn good encapsulation of a simple set of principles. And I do hear the people who say, well, what about the relationship of fair to open? What about the relationship of fair to other requirements of scientists in their conduct, the ethical and responsible things? And my simple answer to that is, let's deal with those things in another category. Let's just separate these for the moment, because FAIR helps us understand very specifically what needs to be done to the data qua data, as data. And that's not to say that the ethical and responsible conduct of science issues aren't important. They are. But as things that are very important, let's deal with them separately in parallel to what we need to do to the data in order to make those data as usable as possible. Because FAIR and the originators of FAIR, and I think will strengthen their elbow for doing this, explicitly wanted to separate open out of fair. They just wanted to, because fair will work even if you're in a very secure data facility where the data can't be communicated to anyone outside, or only in very, very strict circumstances, in one of these data havens, as they're sometimes called. Fair is still important for industry, which won't communicate its data unless under certain duress. Because it's a set of principles that allow us to ensure that the data will have the greatest utility. So that's a long-winded response, but I hope
thank you for your talk. I thought it was quite interesting on its own, but as an international relations student, and I apologise if this question kind of comes out of an entirely left field, at the end of the slide there was mention of discussing the ideas of fair and how they apply with the digital Belt and Road in China. And I was kind of just wondering, from international relations standpoint, how do you think a country's international relations or international dilemmas or security dilemmas kind of impact the ability
so the international
relations of a state, or their security dilemmas or issues that come up within those fields? How do you believe that those instances actually impact the way in which data can be exchanged openly between states and other bodies such as that?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are fundamental challenges and issues. I mean, there's various things to unpack from that. We're very interested in issues of science diplomacy and the component of that, which is data diplomacy, and that covers a number of things. It covers the role of data in informing international treaties. It covers international treaties and collaboration that deal with data. So the Antarctic Treaty, which has data clauses, etc., etc. And it covers, yes, those issues around data sharing globally. In 2000, I didn't really cover this, but in 2004 and 2008, CODATA ran workshops between the US National Committee and the Chinese National Committee, which led to considerable investment in China in research data infrastructures, and some of those research data infrastructures do make their data available. So there is data sharing in and from China. One of the CODATA task groups has developed and implemented a publishing model, a data journal for sharing geography and sustainable development data. There will always be governmental concern about data sharing in many aspects. I touched on some of them relating to Sendai reporting, which is the concern about reputation. And there will be, if you look at certain geographical locations in Google Maps, you will see that certain bits have been pixelated out. There's a military installation just south of Paris, where I live, which is right next to it's a 19th century fort, but using 17th century architecture. So I'm very interested in that sort of thing. And then part of it's pixelated out, so I couldn't see exactly so I had to go and visit it. There will always be that, and China, in particular, will be reluctant to share certain data sets, for sure. There's issues that one of our groups, or people that I know, have studied on river basins. So river basins are a classic issue of reluctance to share data because of the use of water upstream, downstream pollution, use of the water for agriculture, and then the responsibility and the economic implications of that responsibility for use of that water resource. In the end, what can we do other than encourage governments to share those data so that we can have evidence-based solutions and treaties around the use of the water in that river? But yes, that's doubtless naive, and realpolitik will get in the way.
We'll have to introduce you to the Murray-Darling Basin. And that's inside the one country.
Is it between states?
Yes.
Yeah.
Three states.
Right.
everyone for braving the fierce onset of Canberra winter. We were wondering whether we should sort of pitch this talk as a cross-cutting data system talk, or I was thinking, oh, who's going to come to us something just about data and science? And maybe we should really just get all the infectious diseases epidemiologists at the ANU together. But I'm glad we didn't, because we've had a much richer discussion here across the really important cross-cutting position of data in research, or in science, as we say. So thank you very much. The discussion has been a really rich part of tonight. And then on behalf of the Academy and the IRDC, thanks very much to Simon for travelling here and giving us such an insightful view into some of these grand challenges and really pitching it at that societal level, but inspiring us as to how data and how science can really help to do that. So should we thank Simon one more time?
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.